On September 9, 1739, 23 colonial bodies were discovered along a 10-mile stretch of South Carolina's Stono River Road, their heads severed and arranged in a pattern that colonial authorities would later describe only as deliberate. The incident remains one of the bloodiest single-day revolts in American colonial history, yet official records from the time contain fewer than 40 words about the man identified as its leader, a slave named Jemmy, whose real name and origins were never documented. For nearly 3 centuries, the colony of South Carolina sealed every witness testimony, every militia report, every judicial proceeding related to what happened that Sunday morning. What they buried wasn't just the story of a rebellion. It was evidence of something that challenged everything the plantation system claimed about the people it enslaved. Before we continue with the story of Jemmy and the blood-soaked morning that would change South Carolina forever,
subscribe now to the Chronicles of Dread for more chilling stories.
Hit that bell icon so you never miss these forgotten chapters of American history. And I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? Drop your state or city in the comments below. Now let's go back to the summer of 1739, when the colony was about to learn that some men cannot be broken. The summer of 1739 brought oppressive heat to the Carolina Lowcountry, the kind that made even breathing feel like labor. St. Paul's Parish, 20 miles southwest of Charlestown, stretched along the Stono River in a patchwork of rice plantations, each one a small kingdom unto itself. The plantations here were larger than most in the colonies. Some holdings exceeded 1,000 acres, with slave populations that outnumbered white settlers by ratios as high as 10 to 1. The economy ran on rice, and rice ran on the backs of enslaved Africans who possessed the agricultural knowledge that made Carolina's planters wealthy beyond the dreams of European nobility. The Hutchinson plantation occupied prime riverfront property, its big house overlooking fields that had been carved from cypress swamps through years of backbreaking labor. William Hutchinson had inherited the property from his father and expanded it aggressively, purchasing 42 slaves in the past 3 years alone. Among them was a man the plantation records identified simply as Jemmy. No surname, no age, no notation of origin beyond the single word, Angola, written in faded ink. But the slaves who worked alongside Jemmy knew more. They knew he spoke 4 languages fluently. They knew he could read and write in Portuguese, a skill he hid carefully from the overseers. They knew that the scars on his back told a story of resistance, not submission, and that he'd been sold 3 times in 2 years before Hutchinson purchased him. Plantation owners passing him along like a bad debt, unable to break his spirit but unwilling to suffer his defiance. What the white population of St. Paul's Parish didn't know, or refused to acknowledge, was that many of the slaves working their fields had been soldiers, farmers, and craftsmen in their homelands. Jemmy himself had been a military commander in the Kingdom of Congo before Portuguese slavers raided his village. He understood strategy, tactics, and the psychology of warfare. The plantation system had stripped him of his name, his family, and his freedom, but it had not stripped him of his mind. The colony was on edge that summer for reasons that had nothing to do with the slave population. War had broken out between Britain and Spain, and Spanish Florida, just 100 miles south, had begun offering freedom to any English slave who could reach St. Augustine. The colonial government had issued stern warnings against slaves traveling without passes, doubled the patrols, and increased the brutality of punishments for even minor infractions. Fear hung in the humid air like Spanish moss, thick and suffocating. On the Hutchinson plantation, the overseer, a man named Ezra Cobb, had responded to the increased tensions by becoming more vicious. Cobb was a short man with a perpetual sunburn and eyes that seemed to catalogue every moment of rest as theft. He carried a whip made from dried bull hide, and he used it liberally. The slaves called him Red Devil in their native tongues, though never within his hearing. Jemmy had been on the plantation for 8 months. In that time, he'd been whipped 4 times, Once for making eye contact with Hutchinson's wife, once for speaking in his native language, once for pausing to drink water without permission, and once for reasons Cobb never bothered to explain. Each punishment had been delivered in front of the other slaves, a ritual of humiliation designed to break not just the body, but the soul. It was during the fourth whipping on a Tuesday afternoon in late August that something changed in Jemmy's eyes. The other slaves saw it, a light going out, or perhaps a different kind of light coming on. He took the lashes without making a sound, his jaw clenched so tightly that blood ran from where he'd bitten through his own lip. When Cobb finally tired and moved on to inspect the rice fields, Jemmy stood up, wiped the blood from his mouth, and went back to work without a word. That night, in the slave quarters, a series of crude cabins with dirt floors and walls that let in every mosquito and snake, Jemmy began to talk. Not to everyone, only to certain men, and only in whispers. He spoke in Kikongo to those who understood it, in Portuguese to others, in broken English to those who knew no other tongue. He asked questions. He listened more than he spoke. He was gathering information the way a general surveys a battlefield. The conversations continued for 2 weeks. During those whispered exchanges, Jemmy learned which slaves had been soldiers, which had been farmers who knew the land, which had been craftsmen who could improvise weapons. He learned which overseers were cruel and which were merely indifferent. He learned the schedules of the patrols, the locations of the weapons stores, the routes to Spanish Florida. And he learned that he was not alone in his rage. There was Cato, a man from the Gold Coast who'd watched his son sold away to a plantation in Virginia. There was Monday, from the Bambara people, who bore scars from a failed escape attempt that had cost him 3 toes on his left foot. There was Solomon, who'd been literate in Arabic before the slave ship, and who now worked in silence while planning in secret. There was Quash, barely 20 years old, who'd been born free in Benin and kidnapped by raiders when he was 15. These men, and others like them, had been waiting for someone to give voice to the fury they carried. Jemmy became that voice. Sunday, September 9th, 1739, dawned with a strange stillness. The air felt heavy, pregnant with something the white population couldn't name, but the enslaved population recognized immediately. It was the weight of a decision made, of a point of no return crossed. Most of the white families in St. Paul's Parish attended church services at Willtown Presbyterian, a small wooden structure that sat near the intersection of the Savannah Road. The law required plantation owners to allow their slaves to rest on the Sabbath. Though rest was a relative term, there was always firewood to chop, meals to prepare, animals to tend. But on this particular Sunday, the masters and their families would be gathered in one place, singing hymns while their slaves remained scattered across the plantations. Jemmy rose before dawn. He did not eat. In some cultures, warriors fasted before battle, and though he'd been forced to abandon many of his traditions, this one he kept. He walked through the pre-dawn darkness to the edge of the Hutchinson property, to a spot where a massive live oak tree marked the boundary between one man's kingdom and another's. 6 men were waiting for him there. They'd come from neighboring plantations, moving through the darkness with the practiced silence of hunters. No words were spoken. They'd already said everything that needed saying in the previous weeks. Instead, Jemmy simply nodded, and the 7 of them began to move. Their first stop was Hutchinson's tool shed, a sturdy structure where the plantation kept implements too valuable to leave in the fields. The door was locked, but Monday had stolen the key 3 days earlier, during a moment when Cobb was distracted by a broken wagon wheel. Inside, they found what they needed: axes, hoes, pitchforks, a single rusted sword that had belonged to Hutchinson's grandfather. Jemmy took the sword. It felt right in his hand, familiar despite the years since he'd held one. The others armed themselves with tools that could become weapons, their faces showing a mixture of fear and determination that Jemmy recognized from his days as a commander. These were not soldiers, not anymore, but they would have to become soldiers again. The sun was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky when they approached the big house. Hutchinson would be awake, preparing for church. His wife would be in the kitchen, directing the house slaves in the preparation of Sunday breakfast. His two sons, boys of 13 and 15, would still be sleeping in the upstairs bedrooms. What happened in the next 30 minutes was never fully documented. The official colonial records contain only a single sentence. The Hutchinson family and their overseer were killed in their home by rebellious slaves. But the few surviving letters from neighbors who saw the aftermath tell a different story, one written in blood and terror. The attack was swift and silent. Cobb, who'd been walking toward the slave quarters to roust someone for an early chore, never saw Jemmy coming. The overseer died without making a sound, his neck opened by a single stroke of the rusted sword. His body was left where it fell, face down in the red Carolina clay. The Hutchinson house was next. The front door stood unlocked. Who needed locks when you owned everyone for miles around? Jemmy and his men moved through the rooms like a violent tide. The kitchen slaves, startled from their work, were told in rapid whispers to flee or join. Most fled. One, a woman named Phoebe, who'd been Hutchinson's favorite target for abuse, picked up a knife and followed Jemmy up the stairs. William Hutchinson died in his bedroom, still in his nightclothes, reaching for a pistol he never managed to fire. His wife's screams were cut short. The boys, and here the historical record becomes deliberately vague, were found later by militia members who refused to describe what they'd seen, noting only that the youth of the victims did not spare them from the rebels' fury. But it was what Jemmy did next that would define the legend and the horror of that day. The colonial militias had a practice, one they'd learned from European wars and adapted to their own purposes. When rebels or criminals were executed, their heads were sometimes displayed on pikes as warnings. The plantations had adopted similar tactics. More than one slave who'd attempted escape had been made an example of in ways designed to terrorize others into submission. Jemmy knew this practice well. He'd seen it. He'd endured the sight of it. And now, with the Hutchinson family dead and the sun rising over South Carolina, he decided to send a message that the colonial authorities would never forget. Using Cobb's own axe, the one the overseer had wielded with such enthusiasm, Jemmy separated William Hutchinson's head from his body. He did the same to Cobb. And then, with a deliberateness that spoke of ritual rather than rage, he placed both heads on the fence posts at the entrance to the plantation, facing the road where Sunday travelers would see them. It was a declaration of war, written in the language the plantations understood best. By the time the sun had fully risen, Jemmy and his growing group had moved on. Word spread through the slave quarters with a speed that astonished the white population. How could people without literacy, without horses, without any of the tools of communication organize so quickly? The answer, though simple, was one the colonists refused to accept. The enslaved population had always been organized, always been watching, always been waiting for the right moment. At the Godfrey plantation 2 miles south, 12 more slaves joined the rebellion. At the Wallace place, another 8. They moved down the road toward Spanish Florida, and with each plantation they passed, their numbers grew. Some joined willingly, fired by years of accumulated rage. Others joined out of fear that refusal would mark them as collaborators, fear that the rebellion would fail and they'd be punished anyway for not stopping it. The pattern established at the Hutchinson plantation repeated itself at 6 more locations that morning. The attacks were not random or chaotic. Jemmy had prioritized targets based on the cruelty of the owners and the strategic value of the properties. The Lemmy plantation, owned by a man notorious for working his slaves to death and simply purchasing new ones, was hit next. Then came the Sprys, the Sacheverells, the Nathaniel Perrys. At each location, the same grim ritual. The owners killed, their heads removed and displayed. The brutality of it shocked even the battle-hardened militia members who would later investigate. But for Jemmy and his followers, it served a dual purpose. First, it terrorized the white population into paralysis. Many families, hearing the news, barricaded themselves in their homes rather than attempting to fight. Second, it signaled to other enslaved people that this was not an escape attempt. This was a revolution. By mid-morning, somewhere between 60 and 100 slaves were moving down the road, armed with an increasingly sophisticated collection of weapons. They'd raided a general store owned by a man named Sacheverell, acquiring firearms, ammunition, and rum. The rum would prove to be a critical mistake, but in the moment, it felt like a celebration. For the first time in their lives on Carolina soil, these men and women were free, and they were powerful, and they were feared. Lieutenant Governor William Bull was traveling from Charlestown to his plantation that morning when he encountered the group on the road. Bull, who would later give testimony that shaped the official record, described seeing a large number of armed Negroes marching with drums and colors, calling out, "Liberty!" He managed to avoid capture, spurring his horse into the forest and riding hard for the nearest militia post. His arrival at Willtown, where the local militia was drilling after church services, changed everything. Captain B, who commanded the local colonial forces, immediately called for a full mobilization. Riders were dispatched to neighboring parishes. Church bells rang out warnings. Within 2 hours, militia members from across the region were converging on the road south of Stono. But Jemmy and his followers had already traveled 10 miles. They'd stopped at the Edisto River at a place called Jacksonboro. And here, whether from overconfidence, exhaustion, or the effects of the liberated rum, they made their fatal error. They stopped to rest. The debate among the group's leaders was fierce. Some wanted to continue immediately toward Florida, covering as much ground as possible before the militia could organize. Others argued they needed rest, needed to consolidate, needed to plan. The sun was high and brutal. The journey ahead was still 60 miles through hostile territory, and they'd been up since before dawn, running on adrenaline and rage. Jemmy made the decision to stop. In his defense, he was making calculations based on warfare in Congo, where armies maneuvered with supply lines and territorial knowledge. He didn't fully understand the speed with which colonial communications could operate, the network of riders and bells and prearranged signals that allowed plantations to coordinate defensive measures. They posted sentries, but the rum had made the men careless. Some celebrated, others argued about what to do with the slaves who joined them unwillingly. A few tried to organize the group into military formations, but they were working with farmers and field hands, not soldiers. The discipline that Jemmy had maintained during the morning's raids began to fray in the afternoon heat. It was nearly 4 o'clock when the militia arrived. The Battle of Stono, as it would later be called, lasted less than an hour. But that single hour would reshape slavery laws across the American colonies and create a legend that would be whispered about in slave quarters for generations. Captain B approached with approximately 40 militia members, all on horseback, all armed with muskets and pistols. They had the advantage of surprise, organization, and sobriety. Jemmy's group spread out along the riverbank, scrambled to respond. The first volley of musket fire cut down 7 men before most of the group even realized they were under attack. Jemmy, to his credit, immediately tried to organize a defense. He gathered the armed men into a line, shouting orders in multiple languages, trying to create the kind of disciplined formation that might withstand a cavalry charge. For a few moments, it almost worked. The rebels returned fire, and 2 militia members fell from their horses. The group began to move toward a defensive position near a grove of trees, covering each other's retreat with the kind of coordinated movement that surprised the colonial forces. But coordination only matters when you have the numbers and weapons to sustain it. The militia had both, and more critically, they had reinforcements coming. By the time the second wave of colonial forces arrived, another 30 men from neighboring parishes, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The battle became a rout. Slaves scattered into the surrounding forest, dropping weapons and running for their lives. Some tried to surrender, hands raised, pleading in broken English or their native tongues. They were shot anyway. The militia had come not to arrest, but to annihilate, to send a message as brutal as the one Jemmy had sent that morning. Jemmy himself fought to the last. Multiple accounts describe him standing his ground near the riverbank, the rusted sword in one hand and a captured pistol in the other. He was surrounded by 6 dead militiamen, evidence of his skill and fury when a musket ball struck him in the chest. He went down hard, blood spreading across his torn shirt. But here's where the official record and the whispered stories diverge. The militia's after-action report states that Jemmy died of his wounds at the battle site. It notes that his body was decapitated, along with those of 13 other rebels, and that their heads were displayed on posts along the road for the next several months as warnings. Case closed, rebellion crushed, order restored. But the slaves who survived, and there were survivors, captured rather than killed, eventually sold to plantations in distant colonies, told a different story. They claimed that when the militia members approached Jemmy's body, he was still breathing, that they stood around him in a circle, debating what to do. That one man, they couldn't remember his name but they remembered his eyes, leaned down and whispered something to Jemmy in Portuguese. What was whispered? None of the survivors would say. Some claimed they didn't hear. Others said they heard but didn't understand. One woman, sold to a plantation in Georgia 3 months after the rebellion, told her story to a traveling minister 40 years later. She said the man asked Jemmy a single question. "Who are you?" And Jemmy, with blood filling his lungs, with his life draining into the Carolina soil, smiled and answered in clear Portuguese, "I am the one you could not break." Then he died. Or so the story went. The immediate aftermath of the Stono Rebellion was brutal beyond measure. The colonial government, terrified by how close the slaves had come to succeeding, enacted a campaign of retribution designed to traumatize the entire enslaved population into permanent submission. Over the following week, militia members hunted down escaped rebels throughout the Lowcountry. Some were found hiding in cypress swamps, half-starved and delirious from infected wounds. Others were betrayed by fellow slaves, desperate to prove their own loyalty and avoid collective punishment. A few made it as far as 30 miles toward Florida before being captured by tracking parties that used bloodhounds imported specifically for hunting human beings. The executions were public and prolonged. The colony wanted every slave in Carolina to witness what happened to those who chose resistance over submission. Bodies were burned, heads were displayed. The road from Stono to Charlestown became a gallery of horror, lined with human remains in various states of decay. But something wasn't adding up. The official count placed 23 white colonists dead in the initial attacks. The militia reported killing approximately 40 rebels during the battle and immediate pursuit. Another 13 were captured and executed publicly in Charlestown. That should have accounted for most of Jemmy's force, given that estimates placed the rebel numbers between 60 and 100. Yet plantation owners across the region reported slaves missing who'd never been found. The colonial records, usually meticulous about property loss, became strangely vague when it came to accounting for every enslaved person in St. Paul's Parish that September. Some historians would later estimate that between 20 and 30 slaves simply vanished during the chaos, too many to be explained by deaths in the battle or escape attempts. And then there were the stories. 3 weeks after the battle, a plantation owner named Robert Pringle in St. James Parish, 40 miles north of Stono, reported that one of his slaves, a man who'd been born on the plantation and never shown any signs of defiance, had hanged himself in his cabin. When they found the body, there were words carved into the wooden wall beside him, written in a language no one in the household could identify. A visiting merchant from Portugal was brought in to translate. He went pale when he saw the words and refused to say what they meant, claiming only that it was a military phrase from Africa. 2 months after that, a rice field overseer on the Drayton plantation went missing. His horse was found near the Stono River, but his body was never recovered. The slaves on the plantation claimed they knew nothing, but several were seen making offerings at the base of a large oak tree near where the horse was found, offerings of food, tobacco, and strange carved wooden figures. And then there was the matter of the heads. The colonial government had ordered that the heads of executed rebels be left on display indefinitely as a permanent warning. But slowly, mysteriously, they began to disappear. Not all at once, that would have prompted immediate investigation. But one by one, over the course of several months, the heads vanished from their posts. Some were attributed to scavenger animals. Others were blamed on storm damage. But militia members who'd been tasked with maintaining the displays reported something that made their commanders uncomfortable. The heads weren't falling off due to decay or weather. They were being removed, carefully, deliberately, in the night. Jemmy's head, or what was supposed to be Jemmy's head, was the first to disappear. The disappearances prompted wild speculation. Some colonists believed the Spanish were sending agents north to retrieve the remains as propaganda tools. Others thought escaped rebels were conducting nighttime raids to honor their dead. A few, though these were only mentioned in private letters, never public documents, wondered if something else was at work. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Stono intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The investigation into the rebellion was led by Lieutenant Governor Bull himself, who had personal reasons for wanting answers. He'd barely escaped with his life that Sunday morning. He interviewed dozens of captured slaves, plantation owners, militia members, and anyone else who might shed light on how the rebellion was organized so efficiently. What he discovered troubled him more than the rebellion itself. Jemmy, it turned out, was not just literate, but highly educated. Several slaves testified that he'd been teaching others to read in secret, using the Bible as a text, the only book slaves were sometimes permitted to access. He'd been studying maps he'd glimpsed in the Hutchinson house during his rare trips inside to deliver messages. He'd been cataloging the schedules of militia patrols with the precision of a military intelligence officer. More disturbing were the testimonies suggesting that Jemmy had been in contact with other slaves across multiple plantations for months before the rebellion, building a network that the white population had never detected. How they communicated, how they sent messages across distances without literacy, without freedom of movement, without any of the infrastructure white colonists took for granted, remained a mystery that Bull never solved. One captured rebel, a man named Caesar, who'd been among Jemmy's closest associates, was subjected to enhanced interrogation, a colonial euphemism for torture. Before he died from his injuries, he made a statement that Bull included in his report, but couldn't explain. Jemmy didn't start this. He finished what was already begun. We've been waiting for someone like him for 100 years. What did that mean? Who or what had begun the process that Jemmy finished? Bull never found out, and eventually, he stopped asking. The answers were too destabilizing to the social order he was trying to preserve. The Security Act of 1740, passed by the Colonial Assembly 6 months after the Stono Rebellion, was one of the most comprehensive slave codes ever enacted in English North America. It prohibited slaves from gathering in groups without white supervision, banned the use of drums, which could be used to communicate over distances, forbade slaves from learning to read or write, and imposed harsh penalties on any slave found off their plantation without written permission. The act also included a provision that seemed almost paranoid in its specificity. It required plantation owners to maintain detailed records of any slave who demonstrated unusual intelligence, military knowledge, or facility with languages. These individuals were to be reported to colonial authorities and, if necessary, sold out of the colony entirely. The provision was a direct response to Jemmy, though his name appeared nowhere in the legislation. The colonial government understood, even if they couldn't publicly admit it, that the greatest threat to the plantation system wasn't the cruelty of slavery. That was the system's foundation. The greatest threat was the possibility that enslaved people might organize. might remember their military training, might refuse to accept the lie that enslavement was natural or inevitable. But laws could only do so much. And in the months and years following the rebellion, strange patterns emerged that suggested the story hadn't ended on that riverbank at Jacksonboro. The winter following the rebellion brought an unusual cold to the low country. Ice formed on the Stono River for the first time in living memory, and plantation owners huddled in their houses, burning through firewood at unprecedented rates. The cold affected the enslaved population far worse. Their cabins offered little protection against the wind that howled off the river, and thin blankets provided minimal warmth against temperatures that dropped below freezing most nights. It was during this brutal winter that the first authenticated account of what came to be known as Jemmy's witnesses emerged. A house slave named Dinah, who worked in the home of Samuel Swinton, a plantation owner who'd lost his brother in the Stono attacks, reported to her master that slaves were holding secret gatherings in the woods at night, despite the new laws explicitly forbidding such meetings. Swinton, paranoid and grief-stricken, organized a night patrol with 3 neighboring plantation owners. On the evening of January 14, 1740, they discovered approximately 30 slaves gathered in a clearing 2 miles from the nearest plantation. The slaves were seated in a circle around a small fire, and in the center of that circle was an elderly man, a slave from the Drayton plantation known only as Old Marcus, who was speaking in a language none of the white men recognized. The patrol broke up the gathering violently. Old Marcus was arrested and subjected to interrogation that lasted 3 days. What he revealed under duress became one of the most closely guarded secrets of the colonial administration, contained in letters between Lieutenant Governor Bull and the Governor of Virginia that wouldn't be discovered by historians until the 1920s. Old Marcus claimed he'd been conducting a memorial service for those who died at Stono. But it wasn't a Christian service. It was something older, drawn from traditions that predated the slaves' arrival in America. He said the gatherings had been happening since October, always in secret, always in locations that changed from week to week. He said that over 200 slaves across 5 parishes had attended at least one gathering. And he said something else, something that Bull initially dismissed as the ravings of a tortured man, but that haunted him for the rest of his life. Jemmy knew he would die. He planned for it. He told us what to do after he was gone. We are doing it. What did that mean? Bull tried to extract more information, but Old Marcus died from his injuries before providing details. The colonial government, already anxious about appearing weak in the wake of Stono, decided to bury the information rather than investigate further. Publicizing the existence of an organized network of memorial gatherings would only dignify the rebellion and potentially inspire others. But the gatherings didn't stop. Throughout 1740 and into 1741, plantation owners reported suspicious activities. Slaves disappearing for hours at night, strange symbols carved into trees at the edges of properties, small offerings of food left at specific locations. The patrols were doubled, then tripled. Dogs were brought in from as far away as Virginia to track nighttime movements. Several slaves were caught and punished severely, yet the activities continued. Slave revolts had been relatively rare in South Carolina before Stono. After Stono, they became even rarer in the immediate aftermath, but they never disappeared entirely. What emerged instead was something more subtle and potentially more dangerous. A culture of resistance that operated beneath the surface of plantation life, invisible to white authority, but clearly understood by the enslaved population. In June of 1740, a rice field on the Middleton plantation was discovered to have been deliberately sabotaged. Someone had opened the irrigation gates during a critical growing phase, flooding the field and destroying what would have been a valuable harvest. No culprit was ever identified, though 3 slaves were whipped on suspicion. 2 weeks later, a similar incident occurred on the Lowndes plantation, then again on the Waring place. The pattern continued throughout the summer. Tools went missing and were found broken in distant locations. Oxen were released from their pens and scattered. Small fires broke out in storage buildings, always at night, always quickly discovered before they could spread. The economic damage was significant but not catastrophic. These weren't attempts to destroy the plantation system, but rather to demonstrate that it was vulnerable. That control was never total. Lieutenant Governor Bull recognized the pattern. In a letter to the Board of Trade in London, dated August 3, 1740, he wrote, "We face a peculiar situation wherein the Negro population engages not in open rebellion, but in persistent acts of defiance that suggest coordination across great distances. It is as though the spirit of the Stono insurrection did not die with its perpetrators, but instead transformed into something more insidious and harder to combat." The Security Act was meant to prevent another Jemmy from emerging. What it couldn't prevent was the memory of Jemmy from spreading. In 1741, a rebellion plot in Charlestown was discovered before it could be executed. The conspiracy involved over 50 slaves and included plans to burn the city and escape to Florida during the confusion. The discovery came through an informant, a slave who'd been promised freedom in exchange for betraying his fellows. When interrogated, one of the conspirators mentioned being inspired by the soldier from Stono, who'd shown that resistance was possible. The conspirators were executed publicly in Charlestown, their bodies displayed in chains along the harbor as warnings. But the executions had an unexpected effect. Rather than terrorizing the enslaved population into submission, they created martyrs. The men died without begging for mercy, without providing additional names, without showing the fear their executioners expected. One man, as the noose was placed around his neck, reportedly smiled and said, "Tell them Jemmy sends his regards." The phrase became a kind of code among enslaved people in the years that followed. "Jemmy sends his regards" appeared carved into barn walls, whispered in passing between field workers, included in the spirituals that slaves sang while working. Colonial authorities knew it was significant, but could never quite stamp it out. Banning the phrase only made it more powerful, transforming it from words into a symbol of defiance that required no explanation. In 1744, a group of 15 slaves from the Willtown area attempted a coordinated escape, armed with stolen weapons. They made it 23 miles before being captured by a tracking party that used bloodhounds imported specifically for hunting human beings. Their leader, a man whose plantation name was Sambo, but whose real name was never recorded, fought the militia members with a rusted sword, remarkably similar to the one Jemmy had carried. When asked where he'd gotten it, Sambo smiled and said, "It was given to me by a ghost." The sword was confiscated and eventually ended up in the possession of Captain Nathaniel Barnwell, the militia captain who'd led the tracking party. Barnwell kept it mounted above his fireplace, a trophy from what he considered a successful hunt. He would show it to visitors, telling the story of the capture with embellishments that made himself more heroic with each retelling. But 3 years later, when Barnwell died of yellow fever, a disease that swept through Charlestown that summer, killing indiscriminately, his widow sold off his belongings to pay debts. The sword was purchased by a traveling merchant named Jacob Levy, who claimed he wanted it for a private collection in Philadelphia. Levy left Charlestown in September of 1747 and was never seen again in South Carolina. The sword disappeared into the north, and colonial authorities lost track of it. 2 years after that, a plantation owner in Georgia reported that one of his newly purchased slaves, a man bought from a dealer who specialized in difficult slaves sold out of other colonies, had a sword matching the description of Barnwell's trophy. When confronted, the slave claimed ignorance of how it came into his possession, saying only that it had been in his cabin when he arrived. The plantation owner, unsettled by the coincidence, destroyed the sword in a forge and never spoke of it again, except in a single letter to a cousin in Charlestown. But the rumors persisted. Slaves throughout the Low Country whispered about Jemmy's sword, a weapon that couldn't be destroyed, that passed from hand to hand, appearing wherever enslaved people needed a reminder that resistance was possible. Was there really only one sword, or were there many? Did slaves craft replicas based on descriptions passed down through oral tradition? Or was the entire phenomenon a kind of mass delusion, a psychological rebellion in the absence of a physical one? The colonial authorities couldn't answer these questions, and their inability to do so made them increasingly paranoid. And then there were the rumors, persistent, disturbing rumors that began circulating in the slave quarters and eventually leaked into white society through house servants and informers. The rumors said that Jemmy hadn't died at Jacksonboro, that the body the militia beheaded was someone else, a volunteer who'd agreed to die in Jemmy's place so the leader could escape, that Jemmy had slipped away in the chaos, wounded but alive, and made it to Spanish Florida, where he lived as a free man. The rumors said that he'd founded a maroon community in the Great Dismal Swamp, a vast wetland that straddled the border between Virginia and North Carolina. That dozens of escaped slaves had joined him there, living in hidden villages built on platforms above the water, fishing and hunting and living beyond the reach of colonial law. That he was training soldiers there, teaching them the tactics he'd learned in Congo, preparing for another uprising when the time was right. The rumors said that the heads disappearing from the posts weren't random acts of defiance, but were being collected by Jemmy himself. That he was honoring his fallen comrades in rituals drawn from African military traditions, ensuring that even in death they would be remembered as warriors rather than property. Were these rumors true? Almost certainly not. The historical evidence strongly suggests that Jemmy died at Jacksonboro and that his body was indeed among those mutilated by the militia. The military records from the battle, while incomplete, are consistent in describing a final stand by a group of rebels that ended with the death of their leader. The medical testimony from militia members who treated wounded soldiers described injuries inflicted by someone with formal military training, fighting with a discipline unusual among untrained combatants. And yet the rumors persisted for decades, growing more elaborate with each retelling. By the 1760s, slaves in Virginia were telling stories about a legendary maroon leader who matched Jemmy's description but went by different names: the captain, the warrior, the one who remembers. In North Carolina, a maroon community that was finally destroyed by militia action in 1756 was found to have a carved wooden figurehead at the entrance to their main settlement. A warrior holding a sword, with words carved beneath it in Kikongo that translated roughly to, "We do not forget." The rumors likely emerged from a combination of wishful thinking among the enslaved population and the very human need to believe that heroes don't die, that resistance continues, that defeat is never final. In a world where death was common, where families were separated without warning, where hope was a dangerous luxury, the legend of Jemmy offered something precious. Proof that one man, at least, had lived and died on his own terms. But there's a reason the rumors persisted for so long and spread so far. They served a purpose beyond mere comfort. They kept alive the possibility of resistance when the reality of resistance seemed impossible. They reminded enslaved people that someone like Jemmy had existed, had fought back, had killed his oppressors, and died free rather than live as property. In a system designed to destroy hope, the legend of Jemmy became hope itself. Not hope for immediate liberation, which would have been delusional, but hope that the system was not eternal, that it could be challenged, that enslaved people were not the passive, childlike beings that plantation ideology claimed they were. The colonial government understood this on some level. That's why they were so aggressive in suppressing any mention of Stono, why they passed laws against slaves learning to read or write, why they banned drums and limited gatherings. They weren't afraid of what had happened in 1739. That was over, crushed, buried. They were afraid of what the memory of 1739 might inspire. By the 1750s, the physical evidence of the Stono Rebellion had been erased from the landscape. The heads had all disappeared or decayed. The burned buildings had been rebuilt. The mass graves where rebels had been buried in unmarked pits, graves that the colonial government had deliberately left unmarked to prevent them from becoming pilgrimage sites, were reclaimed by forest and swamp. New slaves, imported from Africa or born into bondage in Carolina, worked the same fields where Jemmy and his followers had once labored, often with no knowledge of what had happened there. The colonial government had achieved what it set out to achieve, the restoration of order and the erasure of memory, or so it seemed. But memory is a difficult thing to erase completely, particularly when that memory serves a purpose for those who carry it. In 1752, a Moravian missionary named Johann Henkel arrived in South Carolina as part of an evangelical movement aimed at converting enslaved people to Christianity. Henkel, unlike many of his contemporaries, believed that slaves had souls worth saving, and that conversion required actually listening to them. He spent 3 years traveling between plantations, conducting services and recording observations in a detailed journal that wouldn't be published until after his death in 1784. Henkel's journal contains several entries that reference Stono, though he had to be careful about what he committed to paper. In an entry dated June 15, 1753, he wrote, "Today I spoke with an elderly Negro woman on the Drayton plantation who claims to remember the Day of Blood, as she calls it. She would not speak of it directly, but instead told me a story about a great warrior from her homeland who challenged a cruel king and died fighting. When I asked if this was a parable from Scripture, she smiled and said, 'All true stories are parables, master.' I suspect she was speaking of matters the colonial authorities would prefer remain forgotten." Another entry from September 9, 1754, exactly 15 years after the rebellion, describes attending a slave gathering that had been approved by the plantation owner as a harvest celebration. Henkel noted that the celebration included traditional African music and dance, which made the white overseers nervous, but which the slaves had assured them was just for entertainment, master. But Henkel, who'd spent enough time among enslaved people to recognize coded communication, noticed something the overseers did not. The songs, while appearing joyful, contain verses in native tongues that speak of fallen warriors and future liberation. The dancers move in patterns that suggest military formations. This is not mere celebration. This is remembrance disguised as entertainment, rebellion preserved in rhythm and motion. Henkel eventually left South Carolina, disturbed by what he'd witnessed and frustrated by his inability to effect meaningful change in the plantation system. His journal, discovered decades later, provided historians with one of the few contemporary accounts of how enslaved people kept the memory of Stono alive through cultural practices that white society dismissed as primitive or entertaining. The architectural changes that swept through low-country plantations in the 1740s and 1750s tell another story about the lasting impact of Jemmy's rebellion. Plantation houses built or renovated after Stono featured higher walls, fewer ground-floor windows, and reinforced doors with multiple locks. Many incorporated what were essentially panic rooms, small, fortified spaces where families could retreat if attacked. Gun cabinets, once kept unlocked or hidden, became prominent fixtures in main halls, always loaded and accessible. The slave quarters changed too, though in different ways. They were moved farther from the big houses, separated by open ground that provided clear lines of sight and clear lines of fire. The spacing between cabins increased, making it harder for large groups to gather without being noticed. Some plantations installed bells that could be rung to summon help from neighboring properties, creating an early warning network across the region. These architectural changes remained standard in South Carolina for the next century, long after the specific fear of another Stono had faded. They became simply the way things were done, with the original reasoning forgotten by later generations. But the buildings themselves remembered what the people who built them feared. In the historical record, Jemmy remains a cipher. We don't know his real name. The name Jemmy was almost certainly a plantation designation, possibly a corruption of a name his overseers couldn't pronounce or didn't care to learn. We don't know his age, though testimonies suggest he was probably in his 30s or early 40s, young enough to lead a physical rebellion, but old enough to have gained military experience in Africa. We don't know whether he had a family, if he left behind a wife in Congo who waited years for a husband who would never return, or if he had children born into slavery in Carolina who grew up never knowing their father's story, possibly not even knowing he was their father. We don't know if he ever truly believed the rebellion could succeed. Did he think they could actually make it to Florida, establish themselves as free men under Spanish protection, and live out their lives in peace? Or did he understand from the beginning that the rebellion was likely doomed, and he simply decided that dying on his feet was better than living on his knees? Was it military strategy or a suicide mission dressed up as revolution? The few slaves who survived Stono and were willing to speak to colonial authorities, always under duress, always with the understanding that their words could lead to their own execution or torture, provided conflicting accounts. Some said Jemmy believed he could succeed, that he'd calculated the odds and thought them favorable if they could reach Florida before the militia organized. Others said he knew it was hopeless, but felt compelled to act anyway, that years of brutality had left him with no choice but resistance or madness. One particularly detailed testimony came from a man named Quash, who'd been captured during the battle and later sold to a plantation in Virginia. In 1755, 16 years after Stono, Quash was interviewed by a Virginia planter who was writing a privately circulated treatise on managing slave populations. Quash, old and resigned to his fate, provided what may be the most honest account of Jemmy's motivations. He never said we would make it to Florida. He never promised freedom or victory. What he said was this: we have three choices. We can work until we die, which will happen soon because Cobb does not care if we live or die. We can try to escape individually, which will fail because they have horses and dogs and we have nothing. Or we can fight together as men and make them remember that we were not always slaves. Even if we lose, and we probably will lose, they will remember. And the ones who come after us will remember. And maybe, someday, that remembering will matter. If this account is accurate, and there's no way to verify it, then Jemmy's rebellion was never primarily about escape. It was about dignity, about refusing to accept the dehumanization that slavery required. It was about creating a memory that would outlast the men who fought, a story that would remind future generations that enslaved people were capable of organized resistance, of military thinking, of choosing death over submission. In that sense, Jemmy succeeded beyond anything he could have imagined. What we do know, from documents that have survived, is contained in a handful of legislative records, personal letters, and administrative reports from the period. We know that on September 9, 1739, approximately 60 to 100 enslaved people in South Carolina rose up against their enslavers, killed 23 white colonists, and marched toward freedom with drums and colors. We know that they were led by a man named Jemmy, who'd been a soldier in Africa before being enslaved, who spoke multiple languages, who could read and write, and who used those skills to organize one of the most significant slave rebellions in colonial American history. We know that the rebellion was crushed with overwhelming violence, and that the colonial response included some of the most repressive legislation ever enacted to control enslaved populations. We know that over the following decade, South Carolina's slave code became a model for other colonies, and later for southern states, creating a legal framework for oppression that would persist until the Civil War. We know that the rebellion terrified the planter class in ways that simple escapes or small acts of resistance never could. It demonstrated, unambiguously, that enslaved people were capable of military organization, strategic thinking, and sustained violent resistance. It proved that the ideology of racial inferiority that justified slavery was a lie. One that enslaved people themselves understood was a lie, even if most white colonists never would. And we know that despite the violence of the suppression, despite the Security Act of 1740, despite the surveillance and control mechanisms put in place after Stono, the spirit of resistance never died in South Carolina. Smaller rebellions continued throughout the colonial period and into the antebellum era. Escape attempts persisted, with some slaves successfully reaching Florida or joining maroon communities in the swamps. Networks of resistance, invisible to white authority, operated beneath the surface of plantation society for generations. The Denmark Vesey Conspiracy of 1822, which planned a large-scale rebellion in Charleston, drew inspiration from stories of Stono passed down through oral tradition. Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia in 1831, while different in its religious motivations, followed a similar pattern of sudden violence and strategic targeting. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, though led by a white abolitionist, was premised on the belief that enslaved people would rise up if given weapons and leadership. A belief rooted in historical examples like Stono that proved slaves were willing to fight for freedom. The legend of Jemmy, the soldier who became a slave who became a revolutionary, lived on in the oral histories of the enslaved population, passed down through generations even as the historical details faded and transformed. By the 19th century, his story had merged with other stories of resistance, becoming part of a broader tradition of remembering that slavery had always been contested, that enslaved people had never accepted their condition as natural or permanent. Frederick Douglass, in an 1857 speech, referenced Stono without naming it. The history of our bondage is marked by moments when men decided they would rather die as free men than live as slaves. These moments are often buried by those who would prefer we forget, but we do not forget. We cannot forget. The blood of those who chose resistance over submission waters the tree of liberty just as surely as the blood of white revolutionaries. Today, there's a historical marker near the site of the Hutchinson Plantation, installed in 1974 as part of South Carolina's Bicentennial Heritage Project. It's a small thing, easy to miss if you're not looking for it. A metal plaque on a post by the side of a rural road with text that's been faded by decades of sun and rain. The marker sits in what is now an industrial area, surrounded by warehouses and distribution centers that have replaced the rice fields and plantation houses. The text is brief, clinical, designed not to offend contemporary sensibilities or disrupt the narrative of gradual progress that dominates public history. It mentions the Stono Rebellion and notes that it was the largest slave uprising in the British mainland colonies before the American Revolution. It provides the date, a casualty count, and a single sentence about the Security Act that followed. It doesn't mention Jemmy by name. It doesn't mention the beheadings or the brutality of the colonial response or the fact that some of the executed rebels were left to rot in chains for months as warnings. It certainly doesn't mention the legends or the rumors or the ways that enslaved people transformed a failed rebellion into a story about dignity and resistance. But the story exists anyway, in the gaps and silences of the official record. It exists in the testimony of Caesar, who said Jemmy finished what others had begun, suggesting a continuity of resistance that predated and outlasted any individual rebellion. It exists in the disappearing heads and the rusted sword that kept reappearing, physical objects that became symbols, weapons that transcended their material limitations to become ideas. It exists in the maroon communities that formed in the decades after Stono, sheltering escaped slaves who remembered the lesson Jemmy taught. That freedom could be taken, even if it couldn't be kept, and that the taking itself mattered. It exists in the architectural changes that still mark the landscape. Plantation houses with their fortified features, their panic rooms, their elevated windows. Buildings that were designed to withstand not hurricanes or floods, but human resistance. Structures that embodied fear disguised as prudence. It exists in the legal codes that rippled outward from South Carolina, shaping slavery laws across the American South for the next century. Every restriction on slave literacy, every prohibition on gathering, every patrol system and pass requirement carried the ghost of Stono within it. The planter class never forgot what happened on September 9th, 1739, even as they tried to make everyone else forget. And it exists in the oral traditions that survived slavery itself, passed down through generations until they could finally be written down and preserved. In the 1930s, the Works Progress Administration conducted interviews with formerly enslaved people as part of the Federal Writers Project. Several of these interviews, conducted with elderly individuals in South Carolina who'd been born in the 1840s and 1850s, contain references to the Old Rebellion and the warrior who fought the masters. The interviewees were recounting stories their grandparents had told them, stories that had survived nearly a century through oral transmission alone. The colonial authorities wanted Jemmy to be a warning, a cautionary tale about the consequences of resistance. Instead, he became something else entirely. He became proof that enslaved people were not property, but people. People capable of courage, strategic thinking, and organized resistance. He became a reminder that the plantation system's greatest fear was justified, that those it oppressed might one day rise up and demand freedom at any cost. Was Jemmy a hero? That depends on who's telling the story and what definition of heroism we're using. To the white colonists of 1739, he was a terrorist, a murderer, proof of the necessity of strict controls and harsh punishments. Their letters and diaries describe him in terms usually reserved for natural disasters, as a force of destruction that had to be contained, not a human being with motivations and agency. He was, in their telling, evidence of what happened when the natural order was disrupted, when slaves were not properly controlled, when the thin veneer of civilization gave way to savage violence. To the enslaved population, both contemporary and in later generations, he was something different. A man who'd been pushed beyond endurance, who'd chosen violence not as a first resort, but as a last one, who'd decided that if he couldn't live free, he would at least die free. He was proof that resistance was possible, that military organization could emerge from the plantation system itself, that the ideology of racial inferiority was a lie that could be exposed through action. But the truth, as is often the case, is more complicated than either narrative allows. Jemmy was a man, not a symbol, though he became a symbol after death in ways he probably never anticipated. He made choices, some strategic and well-considered, others desperate and reactive. He organized a rebellion that failed by every measurable standard. The system he fought against survived for another 126 years after his death. The people who followed him into rebellion either died in the fighting or were re-enslaved, their lives arguably made worse by their participation. The violence he unleashed led directly to harsher laws and more brutal repression, not just in South Carolina, but across the American colonies. And yet his story survived. It survived in ways that successful escapes didn't, in ways that individual acts of resistance couldn't match. It survived because it proved something that the plantation system desperately needed to deny: that enslaved people could organize, could plan, could execute military strategy, could choose death over submission. Every subsequent rebellion, every escape attempt, every act of resistance carried Stono within it, not as a direct inspiration necessarily, but as proof of concept, as evidence that the system was vulnerable. The question of whether the rebellion was worth the cost is one that historians continue to debate. 23 white colonists died, but in the aftermath, dozens of slaves were executed and hundreds more faced increased brutality and surveillance. Did Jemmy's actions improve the lives of enslaved people or make them worse? Did the rebellion advance the cause of freedom or set it back by justifying harsher controls? These questions assume that Jemmy and his followers were engaging in a cost-benefit analysis, weighing outcomes and choosing the path that would lead to the greatest good for the greatest number. But that assumption may be fundamentally wrong. The testimony from survivors suggests that Jemmy and his closest associates understood they were likely going to die. They chose to fight anyway, not because they thought it would lead to better conditions for slaves in general, but because they as individuals could no longer tolerate their own enslavement. In that sense, Stono was not a political revolution, but an existential one. It was not about improving the system or even destroying it, but about asserting, in the most violent way possible, that enslaved people were human beings capable of autonomous action, including the action of choosing when and how they would die. On September the 9th, 1739, a man whose real name we'll never know, A man who'd been a military commander in Congo, who'd been captured and sold and transported across an ocean, who'd been given the name Jemmy by people who owned him as property, picked up a sword and decided that his life belonged to him, not to William Hutchinson or the colony of South Carolina or the economic system that had stole in him from Africa. For one brief, bloody morning, he was free. He led men into battle. He killed his oppressors. He marched with drums and colors toward a Spanish colony that promised liberation. For those few hours, he was not property but a general, not a slave but a soldier, not chattel but a man. And then he died, as revolutionaries often do, believing in a future he would never see. A future where the story of his rebellion would matter, where the memory of his resistance would inspire others, where the system that enslaved him would eventually fall. He was right about that, though it took longer than he could have imagined. Slavery in America persisted for 126 years after Stono, before finally being destroyed. Not by slave rebellions alone, but by a combination of economic forces, political realignments, moral awakenings, and ultimately a civil war that killed more Americans than any conflict before or since. The system that seemed eternal in 1739 proved to be mortal after all. And in that long struggle, in the resistance that persisted through generations, in the refusal of enslaved people to accept their condition as natural or permanent, the spirit of Jemmy lived on. Not in the supernatural sense that the rumors claimed. There was no ghost leading maroon communities or retrieving the heads of fallen comrades. But in the very real sense that every person who chose resistance over submission, who organized rather than submitted, who fought for freedom even when the odds were impossible, carried forward the work that Jemmy began on that September morning. This mystery shows us that history is written by the survivors, but the truth lives in the spaces between official records and whispered stories. It shows us that some acts of resistance fail in their immediate objectives, yet succeed in their deeper purpose, to prove that the oppressed are not defeated, that dignity can be claimed even in death, that memory is itself a form of resistance. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there still secrets buried in the Carolina soil? Truths that even centuries of research haven't uncovered. Could there have been more to Jemmy's plan than the historical record suggests? Leave your comment below and share your theories. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories about the forgotten corners of American history, the rebellions that were suppressed, the voices that were silenced, the truths that power tried to bury,
Subscribe now to the Chronicles of Dread for more.
hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload, and share this video with someone who loves mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about the past. See you in the next video, where we'll uncover another story that history tried to forget.